So yesterday we got some news on Giannis Antetokounmpo, and we talked about the lack of validity from that report. And I basically told y'all that this NBA offseason, do not believe any reports unless it comes from Shams Charania. Well, today, ladies and gentlemen, subscribers and the 57.8% of y'all that are not subscribed yet for some reason, boy, did we get some news from one Shams Charania. As earlier today, he reported the 5 teams that are actively pursuing Kevin Durant, and that includes the Houston Rockets, San Antonio Spurs, Minnesota Timberwolves, New York Knicks, and Miami Heat. We can't be beat unless it's in a trade offer for somebody, because it doesn't seem like we can get anybody. Now, let me pump the brakes just a little bit, because this news isn't really surprising. I mean, these 5 teams are pretty much the 5 teams that have been linked the most to Kevin Durant over the last couple of months. But a lot of that speculation was purely based off Kevin Durant's fit with those organizations and the amount of assets that they have. Because if you look at those 5 teams, you could make a pretty good argument about why a Durant trade would make sense. If you want to start with the Rockets or the Spurs, both of those teams basically have the most assets in the league outside of OKC, and they could theoretically field some very great teams if they were to add Kevin Durant to the roster. And then they could also justify taking on that large Durant contract and looming extension, because their young stars are still a couple of years away from getting paid, like Amen Thompson and, of course, Wemby, respectively. Then if you look at the Timberwolves and the Knicks and the Miami Heat, all of those teams are ones that have been to the conference finals, plural, if you're the Timberwolves and Heat. The New York Knicks, we cannot say that. But all 3 of those teams have been to the conference finals relatively recently, and maybe they could justify that adding Durant would be enough to put them over the top. So that's why those 5 teams have been rumored, but I do find it noteworthy that Shams officially announced that they are in active pursuit. Now, the real exciting news that we could potentially get soon is what teams Kevin Durant himself is actually interested in, but I'm not quite sure that we'll ever get that explicitly stated, because this specific report by Shams does say that the Suns are working with Durant's longtime business partner, Rich Kleiman, which indicates to me that Kevin Durant has already okayed those 5 teams. Otherwise, why would his business partner even be entertaining offers from them? Now, as far as what Kevin Durant wants in his next destination, I'm going to assume that he values winning, because either way he's going to get paid, and he's always been a guy that's valued winning over everything else in this league. That's why he chose to go to the Golden State Warriors, because they gave him the best chance to win. I always respected him for that. I know that made 99% of people hate Kevin Durant, but the way I looked at it, it's like, okay, his goal is to win a championship. If he has an easy path to win a championship or a hard path, why the hell would he take a hard path? I mean, in general, in life, if you watching this video has a goal and you have an easy way of achieving that goal, wouldn't you take it too? I don't know. That's just, I don't blame Kevin Durant for going to the Warriors. So assuming that he still wants to win, does he think that joining one of these 5 teams, does he think that he's good enough to put them over the top? Potentially. I mean, in my opinion, the Timberwolves and the Knicks are probably the teams that are in the best position to win a ring by adding Kevin Durant, because I feel like they have the best complementary pieces, although we don't know exactly who they would be sending out in a Durant trade. But then again, if KD really wants to win, I think it makes the most sense for him to come to the East. I mean, that West is a gauntlet. And of course, in the East next year, you have no Tatum. I'm still holding out hope that Giannis gets traded west. So we all know it's a lot more open in the Eastern Conference, which means that now, well, Miami and the Knicks would have an advantage as far as teams that Durant would want to play for. But also earlier today, shortly after that Shams report, we got a report from the New York Post by a guy named Stephen Bondy, who says that the Knicks are not in the mix for Kevin Durant and they're not actually actively pursuing him. So I understand with Shams, you got to take everything with a grain of salt because he might have agents reaching out to him or other organizations reaching out to him to try to move the leverage in one way or another, whether it's so the Suns can get more for Kevin Durant by saying that there's other suitors, or whether it's Kevin Durant making it look like there's more options out there so he can get paid. Who knows what the situation is, but all these rumors are really just a leverage play. But with Shams, I do find him to be the most trustworthy. But if this is true, and if Durant would want to go east, which is an assumption, and if the Knicks are not going after him, well, then that means that congratulations, the Miami Heat are favorites to land Kevin Durant. But then again, that could just be my delusion talking. I don't know. I keep hearing that the Heat are out on KD because our package can be beat by the Spurs or the Rockets. And truthfully, I think that logic is flawed. Like, yes, I understand that those teams and pretty much every other team in the NBA can outbid Miami Heat when it comes to a bidding war for a superstar. But that really only applies when you're talking about a guy like Giannis, who is somebody that teams would need to go all in for. At 37 years old on an expiring contract, Kevin Durant is not somebody that teams would go all in for. So it really doesn't come down to which team has the most assets. It comes down to who is the most desperate to get Kevin Durant. Because if Miami was willing to give up Ware and Wiggins and 3 first-round picks, well, the Spurs, Rockets, Wolves, and Knicks would be idiots to try to beat that package, as Miami would be stupid to even offer that in the first place. So it's not about having the most assets, but it's about how far these teams are willing to go up in a bidding war. I do think that the most these teams will be willing to offer in terms of draft capital is 2 first-round picks. So if you want to kind of look at that as an even playing field, you can. It's not necessarily true because, of course, if teams were to offer their current 2025 pick, well, the Heat pick at 20 and all these other teams pick above the Heat. So the Suns would know that those picks are better. And also the Heat doesn't have picks from any other teams. They only have their own picks, where a team like the Houston Rockets has the Suns picks, which are very valuable because, of course, if the Suns plan on eventually tanking and rebuilding, they can't do that if they don't have their own picks. So while I say 2 first-round picks is equal to 2 first-round picks, that's not necessarily true. But for the purpose of this video, we're going to assume that is so. So now I want to look at the 5 teams that Shams mentioned and see what young pieces they have that the Suns might be interested in, and also what contracts they have to help match Kevin Durant's salary. Because as a second apron team, it really restricts what the Suns can do via trade, and any incoming players that they receive cannot exceed the value of Kevin Durant's $54.7 million. Unless the Suns were able to shed some salary in a separate trade. But it makes all of this kind of difficult. We're going to start with the San Antonio Spurs, though, who, of course, their best young pieces are Stephon Castle and eventually Dylan Harper, who they will take with the 2nd overall pick in the draft. But I highly doubt that the Spurs would trade either one of those guys. So looking at the rest of the roster, of course, you got De'Aaron Fox. They're not going to move on from him. Devin Vassell is an interesting piece because he is a nice young player. The only issues is for the Suns is that, 1, he's a shooting guard, so his fit next to Devin Booker is a bit questionable. And 2, he's already paid. He's getting paid $27 million over the next 4 years. The Suns might not like the fact that he takes away from some of their cap flexibility, and they also might think that's a bit of an overpay, although I do think Devin Vassell can be a nice starter in this league for a long time. Moving on, you do got Harrison Barnes, who has a lot of value as a $19 million expiring contract, meaning that the Suns could shed a lot of salary next offseason. You also have Keldon Johnson, who's a nice player as well. He's still pretty young, has shown some potential in this league, and his contract is not ridiculous, only $17.5 million for the next 2 years. Of course, the Spurs are not trading Wemby or Castle. And then the last interesting guy you see here is Jeremy Sohan, who fit-wise I do think could fit pretty good on the Suns. He could play a hybrid point forward role where he could guard some bigs and guard some wings, and I think that's something that the Suns can definitely use. And he is a young player to help grow next to Devin Booker. He's on a $7 million expiring deal, which the Suns might like because he's cheap, but they also might not like that because that means that he's due to get paid. The trade package that I cooked up is the Spurs sending over Devin Vassell, Harrison Barnes, Jeremy Sohan, and 1 first-round pick. So they are getting 2 nice young players, 1 pick, and then some salary cap relief with Harrison Barnes. I think this would be good value for the Phoenix Suns. Moving on, let's talk about the Houston Rockets, who right away, you see that massive $45 million Fred VanVleet expiring contract. That is certainly juicy because that is a lot of money that could help the Suns lower their salary cap next year. And obviously, you're already close to matching Durant's salary. You just need to add $10 more million somewhere else. But if not VanVleet, you're not going to trade Alperen Şengün. I can't see that happening. I do think that the Rockets would be more than willing to trade Jalen Green. But why the hell would the Suns want that? Jalen Green certainly does not fit next to Devin Booker, and he's getting paid $33 million for the next 3 years, and I think that's a ton of money. Dylan Brooks is a movable contract, only $21 million over the next 2 years. And then you have a couple of nice young players like Jabari Smith, Reed Shepherd. Those would be the young assets that the Rockets would likely move in any trade. Amen Thompson, they're not going to move. And then you got a couple of other salaries here. Jock Landale, Tari Eason, and then maybe the only other young player that the Suns could be interested in is Cam Whitmore. The mock trade that I put here is that Fred VanVleet expiring deal. And then I have the Rockets also sending over Tari Eason and 2 first-round picks. So the Suns once again get that massive cap relief once that VanVleet contract comes off the books. They do get 1 tangible young player in Tari Eason and then a couple of picks. This would be good value if the Suns were looking to rebuild. Moving on to the Minnesota Timberwolves, you're not trading Anthony Edwards. I'm sure they would love to trade Rudy Gobert. I know the Suns want a center, but they want a good one. Rudy Gobert is not a good center. I do think Julius Randle could be an interesting piece for the Suns because if they prefer to not rebuild, if they prefer to try to remain competitive around Devin Booker, Randle's a guy that had a pretty nice season this past year prior to the conference finals where he flamed out. But before that, he actually was pretty good. And that $30 million expiring deal is juicy because if they don't want to keep him, they could have his money come off the books next year as well. But then you got a lot of great contracts to trade here. Jaden McDaniels, great player on a fair contract. Naz Reid, great player on an expiring contract. And then Dante DiVincenzo, a pretty great player on a pretty cheap contract as well. I don't think that the Timberwolves would trade Mike Conley. And then you got a couple of young players I could see the Suns interested in, like Rob Dillingham or Terrence Shannon. I mean, those guys don't fit great next to Booker either. That's going to be a problem with a lot of these teams, is the best asset they could offer is somebody that plays the same position as Booker. But Dillingham and Terrence Shannon, they're still young enough that maybe you could flip them in a future trade because I do think they have some trade value. The trade package that I did cook up, though, is the Timberwolves sending over Jaden McDaniels, Naz Reid, DiVincenzo, Terrence Shannon, and a first-round pick. I think this is probably way too much for the Timberwolves. The issue is, though, yes, they have a lot of contracts, but it was very difficult to match Kevin Durant's salary because the Timberwolves were also very close to that second apron, heavily limiting what they can do as well. This is really the only semi-realistic way I could see it working contractually. For the Suns, I think it's great value because you are getting ready-to-win now role players that would fit great next to Booker, like Jaden McDaniels, like Naz Reid, although he is due to get paid. And then you are still getting some future assets in Terrence Shannon and an extra first-round pick. So for the Suns, I love this. For the Timberwolves, it's probably too much. But truthfully, they don't have a lot of flexibility in terms of what they can do. So a Durant trade to them would be a bit more difficult than these other teams. Finally, we got the New York Knicks, who we know that Karl Anthony Towns' $53 million contract over the next 3 years is something the Suns would probably want because I do think he's a good center. He's very close with Devin Booker from their days at Kentucky. So I do think that's an interesting contract for the Suns, as is OG Anunoby, as is Mikal Bridges, which would be hilarious if they now trade KD to get Mikal Bridges back. Both those guys make a ton of money, so they could help somewhat facilitates or match a lot of that Durant contract. Obviously, the Knicks aren't going to trade Jalen Brunson, but I could see them maybe moving on from Josh Hart or Mitchell Robinson. They have a few smaller contracts at the end to try to make all the money work. But the trade that I cooked up was the Suns receiving Cat and some guy named Ariel and no picks. I mean, why not trade I was going to say disgruntled player for disgruntled player. I don't think either guy is disgruntled. It's just a bit of an awkward situation, right? Because Cat was traded to the Knicks this past year. He had a lot of ups, but he also had a lot of downs. There were some playoff games where Thibodeau wasn't even playing him, and Thibodeau's not even there anymore. But still, you gave up a lot to get Cat. You're paying him a lot of money. To not play him in some playoff games, or at least not play him more than 25 minutes, is ridiculous. Cat had some terrible plus minuses too, because yeah, he was scoring 20 points, but he was giving up 45. He was atrocious defensively. So maybe the fit wasn't as clean as the Knicks had hoped. So maybe they are willing to move on from him and send him over to the Phoenix Suns, who should want him. I mean, that fit with Booker is impeccable. And then as a Knicks team, I highly doubt they'd want to take a step back after just making the conference finals. That's the last thing that they would want to do to their fans. So why not add in Kevin Durant? You got a bunch of star power, OG, Mikal, Brunson, KD. See what happens. I do think this is not a bad trade for both teams, especially since the Knicks don't lose any picks. And finally, we got the Miami Heat, who are not trading Bam. They're not trading Tyler. That Wiggins $29 million over the next 2 years is a bit interesting. Although as a Heat fan, if the Heat were trying to get KD, I would kind of like to keep Wiggins. I feel like you could use that defensive versatility, and now Wiggins is like your fifth option, which is great. But if the Suns do want Wiggins, because he still is a nice player and he can help be that 3-and-D versatile wing next to Booker, I'd be willing to give up Andrew Wiggins. And then we know Terry and Duncan are on some expiring contracts, which would help the Suns with their cap space. And then the Heat can move Kyle Anderson, Hayward Highsmith. They have some other contracts there of varying values to make the money work. And then the young pieces you're looking at here is really Jovic, Khalil Ware, and Jaime Jaquez. The trade that I cooked up, though, is the Phoenix Suns receiving Terry Rozier, Duncan Robinson, Nikola Jovic, and 2 first-round picks. So they are getting a ton of salary cap relief, especially since they could cut Duncan Robinson right away and save $10 million instantly, because only $9.8 million of his $19.8 million is guaranteed. So Duncan is an interesting trade piece when it comes to his contract. Then obviously Terry would have $27 million come off the books, and the Suns have a great player, Nikola Jovic, who has so much potential that I think Suns fans could get excited about him, and 2 first-round picks. I think this is great value for the Phoenix Suns. Now, of course, we talked about Durant to the Miami Heat many times. A lot of Heat fans want him. A lot of them don't. And all the ones that don't say, why the hell would the Miami Heat want an aging Kevin Durant when even I admitted that he's probably not good enough to help us win a championship? And the answer is, the Heat need to do something. What you cannot do this offseason is run it back. And if that means getting Kevin Durant and then maybe halfway through the season, using your other tradable first-round pick and then the Andrew Wiggins contract, if you don't trade him for Durant, using those assets to get someone else to bring into the roster with Durant, now maybe you're talking about a team that could compete in the East. All you really got to do is get your foot in the door and have a puncher's chance, because if you get to the postseason, you never know what could happen. We're seeing right now the Indiana Pacers, who is a damn good team, I'll say it, but it's an improbable run, and yet they still made it to the NBA Finals, and they're only 3 games away from winning it all. Game 3 is tonight, though, so we'll see what happens. One of the main questions that a lot of people are asking is, would the Miami Heat trade Khalil Ware? I think most Heat fans agree when we say, hell no, unless no picks are involved. Like, if the Heat are able to trade Wiggins, Terry, and Ware with no picks, I suppose I would consider it. The only issue is the Heat would desperately need a center that could play next to Bam Adebayo. But then you'd still have 3 first-round picks and some contracts to try to trade for one. That's the only reason I would consider it. Consider trading Ware, is if you get to keep those picks, because then you could trade for a center. We do know that this past deadline, the Heat were interested in KD, like they have been 4 times now. I think they've been in on KD over the last 10 years, but this specific previous deadline, we know they offered Jimmy, Jovic, J-Rich, and 1 first-round pick, but the Suns wanted everything, which obviously the Heat aren't going to do that. I don't think Durant's value went up since then, so the Suns will be forced to come down a little bit. And if the Heat were to offer the same package, it would basically now be Wiggins, Jovic, and 2 first-round picks. Of course, you'd have to add in Duncan Robinson to make the money work. But I do think the Heat would offer that again. And then the question becomes, those other offers that we looked at from the Spurs and Rockets and Timberwolves and Knicks, would that beat what the Miami Heat could offer? Wiggins, Jovic, and 2 first-round picks? Maybe. I think those could beat the Heat's offer. But would those teams actually be willing to do it? Would the Knicks be willing to trade Towns? Would the Timberwolves be willing to give up all their depth? And that's a big question, because I'm not sure that those teams are as desperate as the Miami Heat, truthfully. The other big question surrounding Kevin Durant is, would the Heat extend him? Because he is due for a 2-year extension of about the same value, about $56 million. And the answer is yes. Why go through all this trouble of trading for Durant if you're not going to extend him? Heat fans will say, oh, you're going to trade Jimmy because he was aging and you didn't want to pay him, but you're going to extend Jimmy? How does that make sense? To me, it does. Because, one, Kevin Durant's a better player. I know he's had his injury concerns, and even this past year, he had some ankle problems, but I think he was shut down for the most part. I do think he could have came back. The year before this previous one, he played 75 games. You just don't have as much injury concerns with KD as you do with Jimmy. And I understand Kevin Durant's older, but he's still a better player. When Jimmy was here the last couple of seasons, he really wasn't that star contributor in the regular season. And that's why the Heat were a playing team for the last several years. Because, yeah, Jimmy was a superstar, but in the postseason, I think KD is still a guy that can perform at a star level in the regular season and in the postseason. And finally, going forward, I do think that his game ages much better than Jimmy Butler, because Jimmy's a guy who relies on his athleticism to play in the passing lanes and also to get in the paint. And pretty much every time Jimmy gets in the paint, he hits the hardwood as hard as he possibly can. And obviously, years after years of just that banging on your body, it takes a beating. Not to mention that Jimmy played with Thibodeau for the first several years of his career, and those kind of heavy minutes really take a toll on your body too. And you compare that to Kevin Durant, where he literally has the best old man game, which is that mid-range shot. If y'all play pickup basketball, who's the dudes that's shooting the mid-range shots? It's all the old guys. That is the definition of old man game. And Kevin Durant is one of the most elite mid-range shooters in NBA history, so I think his game will age very, very well. That's all I got to say for this video, though. I'm almost exhausted talking about Kevin Durant. We've been doing it so much, but damn it, that might be the only guy available. So let me know y'all thoughts down below. If you were out on KD as a Heat fan, let me know if I maybe changed your mind. If not, let me know what team you think he ultimately ends up going to. I'm very curious to hear what y'all think. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe, because I'm on the grind to hit 8,000 subs. And I'll see y'all in the next video. Peace out, everyone.
Look, pull up in your city trying to get that dead face. Do it on my own, I don't need no dead weight. Had to kill him off, yeah, I need a head space. You know this homegrown bitch don't offend me.